The steam whistle shrieked like a hawk over the canyon, echoing through the barren Arizona hills as the train came to a stop beneath the pale spring sky. Clara Rosewell sat upright in the railcar, spine stiff from miles of jostling and silence. Around her, the final passengers were gathering their trunks and shawls, their boots clunking on the worn wood floor as they prepared to disembark. She held still a moment longer, gloved hands resting on a travel case too small for the life she had tried to carry west. In the very bottom of it, beneath a blue dress and a tin of pins, lay a ribbon-tied bundle of letters, one of them nearly torn through at the crease where the sender had written, "I look forward to standing beside you in town." That was from Silas Penry, the man who had written every week for months and spoken of her as though she were some final piece of a puzzle. A strong woman for a strong frontier. The desert wind reached through the open door of the car, carrying dust and juniper scent and something else beneath it. Uncertainty, maybe. Clara gathered herself and stood, the brim of her hat brushing the roof. Already, heads were turning. She stepped down from the train and into Whispering Rock. The platform was nothing more than an uneven slab of boards nailed beside the tracks, and the station a squat wooden shed, leaning south from years of wind. The mountains ringed the edge of town like sleeping beasts, and the air was thin with coming spring. She saw him before he saw her. Silas, standing tall in a clean waistcoat, boots polished, hair oiled back like a man who wanted to be remembered. His gaze moved quickly over her, stopped, then slid off again, as if he had made a mistake. Clara approached with calm steps. She was taller than most men by a head, and she had learned long ago how to soften her stride, how to meet eyes gently, how to smile without shrinking. But Silas did not smile in return. "Miss Rosewell," he said stiff, as though her name were a stone he had to spit out. "You arrived early." "No," Clara replied, her voice even. "The train's on time, just like you asked." A silence stretched between them. Behind her, the conductor threw down a final mail sack, and the train groaned as it prepared to leave again. Silas shifted his weight. His eyes flicked to the passengers lingering behind her, then back. "I thought," he began, and his voice cracked slightly, "that you might have exaggerated." She waited. "I'm a man who believes in appearances, Miss Rosewell," he said at last. "And while I'm sure you're competent, I think we both understand this town wasn't built for expectations that large." Clara blinked. The words were clumsy, but the message was clear. "My height?" she asked. He colored. "A woman should look up to her man, Clara." There it was. The sound of horse hooves clattered somewhere down the road. A stagecoach turned the corner, dust trailing behind it. Silas turned slightly as if preparing to excuse himself, his posture already retreating. She looked at him, his fine jacket, his nervous fingers twitching at his collar, and saw a man who had wanted a paper bride, not a flesh-and-blood woman who stood unshaken in her boots. "Well," Clara said softly, "it appears we were both mistaken." He offered no hand, no apology. With a final glance to ensure no onlookers caught too much of the moment, Silas tipped his hat stiffly and walked away. Alone, Clara turned to face the street of Whispering Rock, a single thoroughfare, lined with clapboard buildings, warped signs, and the occasional lantern post. The desert wind picked up, brushing against her coat and tugging at the hem of her skirt. Around her, a few townspeople watched from behind windows or over porch railings. She stood straight beneath their gaze. A voice, warm and worn, called from nearby. "You come far?" Clara turned. A woman stood beneath a hanging sign that read, "Hensley House, boarding available." She was sturdy, with graying hair tucked under a kerchief and sleeves rolled to her elbows. "I suppose I have," Clara said. The woman looked past her toward the retreating figure of Silas Penry, then back again. Her eyes softened. Well, I've got a room that's warm, and a stew on the fire. If you'd rather not stand here waiting for someone who isn't coming back." Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'm Alma Hensley," the woman added as she led the way. "Widowed 15 years now. I know what it looks like when a woman gets left standing." Clara followed her across the street, their boots echoing against the wood boards. She noticed then a man leaning against a supply wagon nearby, one foot braced on the step, arms crossed. He was older than Silas, broader through the shoulders, with a calm in his bearing that seemed to absorb the dust around him. He wore no fine clothes, but there was something in the way he watched. Not cruel curiosity, but something quieter. Respect, maybe. He tipped his hat as she passed. Clara nodded back. Inside the boarding house, the air smelled of rosemary and tobacco. Lace curtains stirred in the open window, and a kettle hissed softly on the iron stove. Alma showed her to a modest room, a small brass bed, a dresser, a washstand with chipped enamel. The window was narrow and high, letting in slanted gold light. "It ain't Boston," Alma said gently, "but it's home." Clara set her bag down with care. For a long moment she stared at it, then out the window to the pale sky beyond. The wind chimes outside the porch tinkled faintly in the breeze. There was no sound of approaching footsteps, no apology. Her mouth was dry, her heart unexpectedly steady. "I'll take it," she said. Alma smiled and squeezed her hand once before turning to leave. "You won't be the first soul this town misjudged," Alma said softly, holding open the door. "But maybe you'll be the one who doesn't forgive it." By dawn, Clara had unpacked every belonging into drawers that weren't hers, folded dresses that hadn't yet found a purpose, and stared at a window too short to reflect her full face. The first light of day cast long pale lines across the floorboards. Brushing against her travel dress now hanging stiffly from a nail beside the wardrobe. Beneath it, her boots rested with the toes pointed outward, still rimmed with the dust of the train platform. In the quiet hush before the town stirred, Clara sat on the edge of the brass bed and reached for the ribbon-tied bundle of letters. One had slipped halfway from its stack, the one with the bold closing line written in slanted pen. "I look forward to standing together in town." She returned it gently to the bottom of the drawer and closed it with care, as if shutting it too quickly might undo the little strength she had left. The ache from yesterday's humiliation had not faded, but neither had the resolve that had planted itself in her bones the moment Alma opened that boarding house door. Today would not be given over to regret. Outside, the streets of Whispering Rock began to stir. Wagons rolled over frost-stiffened ground. Someone pounded a nail into a signpost. The morning wind, sharp and dry, carried the scent of mesquite smoke and the faint sweetness of drying apples. Clara dressed in silence, coiling her hair into a firm knot, pinning it with practiced hands, and fastening the brooch that once belonged to her mother at the collar of her blouse. She looked to the narrow window. It offered no reflection, but she no longer needed one. In the parlor below, Alma greeted her with coffee and a smile that said little, but meant much. "You good with a needle, Miss Rosewell?" she asked over her shoulder as she ladled hot water into the tin basin. "I sew," Clara replied. Alma nodded, pushing open the cupboard doors to reveal a stack of mended shirts, trousers with torn seams, and aprons missing ties. Then this town's luckier than it knows. By mid-morning, Alma had given Clara the back parlor, a room with dappled sunlight and enough space to set up a sewing table. The parlor's windows opened onto the main street, and within an hour of her first stitch, the townsfolk began to appear. Not with welcome, not yet, but with curiosity and work. A farmer's wife brought in a dress she claimed hadn't fit since the war. A boy delivered a flour sack full of torn linens from the church rectory. And just before noon, as the wind picked up and flapped the curtain hems, there was a knock unlike the others. Clara opened the door and found a man standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-coated coat slung over one arm and a bundle of clothing beneath the other. It was the same man who'd tipped his hat the day before by the supply wagon. He said nothing at first, just nodded once. "You're the seamstress," he said at last. "If the work's honest," she answered. He set the bundle down, shirts mostly, some torn at the shoulders, one scorched near the collar, another with buttons half gone. The sleeves were rolled tightly and tied with twine. "The hollow's hard on clothes," he said. "We're short on hands, shorter on stitches." She looked up at him. There was no judgment in his expression, no flicker of surprise at her height, only tired eyes beneath a furrowed brow. "I'll have them done by week's end," she said. "Sooner if you can." He hesitated, then added, "We don't have many like you here." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Meaning we don't have many who mend what's worth keeping," he clarified. Then, without waiting for reply, he nodded once more and left. She watched him go, noting the way the townspeople parted for him without question, how even the wind seemed to quiet as he passed. Alma appeared beside her, drying her hands with a dish towel. "That's Thaddeus Holt," she said. "Man doesn't talk much, but he listens better than most preachers." Clara returned to her work. As the hours passed, she lost herself in rhythm. The sound of thread pulling clean through cloth, the hiss of the oil lamp, the soft clatter of buttons being sorted into tins. There was comfort in it, in the doing, in shaping something torn into something useful, but not everyone approved. Late in the afternoon, while adjusting a hem at the window, Clara heard laughter outside. She looked up to see two men leaning on the porch rail of the saloon across the way, pointing in her direction. One, a narrow-faced man with a cigar clamped between yellowed teeth, cupped his hands and called across the road. "Didn't know the law hired lady sheriffs now. Or is that a new church bell they're stringing up?" His friend laughed too hard. Clara said nothing. She turned from the window and continued her stitching, but her fingers trembled slightly. Alma closed the shutters quietly. "Don't waste a word on fools who choke on their own spit." Still, the moment clung like smoke. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the reminder that even here, in this new corner of the world, a woman who stood tall and spoke little was still a mirror people didn't want to look into. That night, when Clara returned to her room, she untied the bundle of shirts Thaddeus had left. She smoothed them one by one on the bed, checking for tears, making mental notes. The final shirt was folded more carefully than the others. When she opened it, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. A note, handwritten, tucked between the seams. "If you ever feel out of place, know there's room under the pines." She stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, she folded the shirt again, tucking the note back where it had been, and reached for her needle and thread. The day's dust still clung to the windowsill. Outside, the wind sighed through the alley, stirring the wind chimes on the porch with a sound like the memory of a lullaby she could not name. The storm began as a hush, a stillness in the pines that old loggers called the mountain's warning. Most days, the ridge above Whispering Rock rang with axe strikes and the rhythmic calls of men felling pine. But this morning, even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The clouds hung low, pregnant with something unsaid. And every man on the ridge knew better than to ignore that kind of silence. Down in town, Clara felt it too. A pressure in the air that made her fingers pause over a spool of thread. An unease that coiled in her chest as she stood at the window of the sewing parlor. She couldn't see the ridge from here, but she could feel it. Alma noticed her gaze and followed it. "Ridge speaks before it breaks," Alma murmured, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thaddeus always said that." Clara gave a slight nod, pretending to focus on her stitches, but her mind was already on him. Thaddeus Holt, and the way he'd stood in her doorway just days ago with shirts in his arms and kindness in his eyes. Today, he was up there on Raven Ridge with the rest of the crew, and the mountain had gone still. Before the clock struck 10, the first cry rang out. A rider came thundering into town, horse lathered in sweat, his voice rising like a cracked bell. Slide. Everything stopped. Buckets hit the ground. Curtains twitched. Boots hit the dirt, running. Clara dropped her thimble. Alma was already grabbing her shawl. "They said Holt's down," the rider gasped, breathless. "They're bringing him back." Clara didn't wait for more. She swept up her coat and followed Alma into the street. Snow had begun to fall, soft at first, like feathers drifting on breath, but the wind cut through the town like a blade. Outside the doctor's home, a small crowd was gathering. Clara elbowed her way through just as two men emerged from a wagon, carrying a makeshift stretcher. On it lay Thaddeus Holt, pale, soaked in half-frozen blood, leg twisted wrong, face bruised near black. His coat was shredded, and one boot had been cut off to relieve swelling. "Inside!" Alma barked. "Move!" The crowd parted, and Clara followed them in. The doctor, a thin, sharp-nosed man named Cotter, was already clearing his table. Delilah arrived minutes later, sleeves rolled, voice sharp and sure. "Get boiling water, and someone find me thread that's not horsehair." Clara stood still until Thaddeus stirred. His lips barely moved, but the word came through. "Clara." Delilah turned. "He said your name before mine." But Clara wasn't listening. She stepped forward and took his hand, feeling the heat of fever already rising. His eyes opened just a sliver, enough to find her face, and something in that broken, bloodied look sent a fissure straight through her. They worked for hours. Cotter barked orders, Delilah stitched skin, Alma mopped sweat. Clara didn't leave the room, even when they told her to. She sat by his side, wringing cloths, whispering his name when his breath hitched. The hours passed slow, marked by the clink of tools, the grind of bone, the prayerful murmurs from Alma's lips. Outside, snow thickened, the windows fogged, no one left. When at last Cotter stepped back, his hands covered in blood, he looked down at Clara. "He's strong," he said, "but you best be stronger." The night wore on, and Clara stayed. In the quiet between his ragged breaths, her thoughts wandered. She saw again the way he had carried himself that first day, steady, unshaken, respectful in a world that rarely was. She remembered the note tucked in the shirt. "There's room under the pines," and she knew, suddenly, that she loved him. Not with the frenzy of a girl's first spark, but with the deep, aching certainty of a woman who'd been seen and accepted for all she was. Not despite her height or her silence or her scarred heart, but because of them. The door creaked, and Delilah stepped in, wiping her hands. Her eyes found Clara's where she sat, fingers still wrapped around Thaddeus's hand. "He said your name before he said mine," Delilah murmured from the corner, even with blood in his mouth. Injury kept Thaddeus in bed, but the town's silence was broken by whispers, louder now. Threading through whispering rock like river ice cracking underfoot. Outside the doctor's house, the snow had crusted into a brittle layer over the streets, and townsfolk moved slower through the cold, some to keep warm, others because they had learned something was shifting. The way people looked at Clara had changed. It wasn't quite respect, not yet, but it was no longer dismissal either. She had stayed at his bedside through the worst of it, cleaned his bloodied coat, wiped fever from his brow, mended his hand when he tore the stitches in his sleep. It hadn't gone unnoticed. In the boarding house, Alma kept her tongue still, but set a second bowl of soup out each evening without question. "Some things don't need asking," she said once when Clara tried to protest. Each morning, Clara visited Thaddeus. The smell of liniment and boiled wool clung to her clothes now, as did the weight of unspoken things. He spoke little, a few words, a nod, sometimes the ghost of a smile. But his eyes always followed her, and when she paused long enough, she felt their quiet understanding build like snow on a rooftop. Silent, steady, inevitable. On the third morning after the slide, Silas Penry returned. Clara had been gathering fresh bandages when he walked into the doctor's parlor unannounced, boots too clean for the weather, hat still dusted from the livery, where he no doubt kept it polished. He looked at her as if nothing had passed between them. "Well," he said, adjusting his coat, "seems I misjudged what you were capable of." Clara folded the cloth more tightly than necessary. "And what, exactly, do you believe I'm capable of now, Mr. Penry?" she asked without looking up. He chuckled, falsely light. "Winning a town, apparently." She met his gaze then, sharp and cool. He didn't flinch, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "I came to speak with Holt," he said, shifting focus. "Rail vote's coming up. Thought he ought to know the council's leaning." "You'll have to wait," Clara said. "He's resting." "Then I'll wait." She didn't offer a chair. Delilah entered moments later, apron tied, eyes narrowing at the sight of Silas. She moved to the hearth and stoked the fire, throwing him only a glance. "I'll keep this short," he said. "We need the line. You know it. Holt knows it. But he's sentimental. Still clings to Pine Hollow like it's sacred. It's trees. Nothing more." Clara stiffened. "Pine Hollow feeds the ridge," Delilah said, not turning. "Take it, and the rest slides with the next thaw." Silas shrugged. Progress always has a cost. The door opened from the rear room, slow. Thaddeus stood there, leaning heavily on a cane someone had carved from a pine branch. His face was pale, bandages peeking from beneath his shirt, but his voice was steady. "Then you won't mind paying it yourself." Silas turned, startled. "You should be resting," he said. "I'll rest when you stop circling like a buzzard," Thaddeus replied. The air froze between them. "You'll be at the vote?" Silas asked, smoothing his lapel. "I'll be there," Thaddeus said, eyes never leaving Clara. "But if I can't stand, she'll stand for me." Silas's jaw tightened. He tipped his hat and walked out without another word. Delilah watched the door shut behind him and muttered, "Vultures always move fast when they smell weakness." Clara turned back to Thaddeus. He was bracing against the doorframe, face damp with effort. "You shouldn't be up," she said, crossing the floor to steady him. "I'm tired of lying down," he whispered. She helped him back into bed, her fingers brushing his wrist, and for a moment they lingered there, caught between gratitude and something heavier. The fire snapped and crackled beside them, the scent of smoke curling upward into the rafters. Outside, a wagon rattled past, iron-shod wheels crunching ice. Inside, Clara traced the ridge of the carved brooch on her collar and whispered, "We won't be quiet anymore." The morning of the vote dawned bitter and white, with the wind coming down off the ridge like a blade sharpened on stone. Snow clung to the rooftops of Whispering Rock, frozen in place, and the streets were a crust of ice and rutted mud. The bell above the old courthouse rang out 7 long, solemn notes, summoning the town's menfolk, ranchers, and timber bosses to gather. It wasn't just another town meeting. It was the decision that would shape the future of Pine Hollow itself. Inside the sewing parlor, Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and pinned her hair without looking at the mirror. Today was not about appearance. Today was about standing firm, even if the ground beneath her threatened to buckle. The wooden brooch at her collar, her mother's, rested cool against her throat like a blessing carved from memory. Downstairs, Alma handed her a tin of boiled candies and a warm scarf. "For the dry throat," she said, "and to remind you someone believes in you." Outside, The town moved differently. People whispered less. They watched more. Clara passed the saloon, the post office, the mercantile. Faces peered from behind half-closed doors, and the snow whispered under her boots. She saw the mayor speaking to Silas on the steps of the courthouse, both in long coats, both pretending not to notice her. But others noticed. Women from the church quilting circle nodded slightly as she passed. A pair of young boys stopped their snowplay and stood still. One removed his cap. Inside the courthouse, the benches creaked as people shifted. Men coughed into their gloves. The smell of old pine boards and coal smoke clung to every coat. Clara took her seat near the front, beside Delilah, and a space left open for Thaddeus. He wasn't coming. His leg was too weak. He'd said it that morning, gripping her hand in his. "You know my vote. You know my words. Use them better than I would." Now, as Silas stood at the podium, papers in hand, voice smooth as riverstone, Clara prepared herself. "We've all seen what the railroad can bring," he began. "Trade, commerce, connection. It's time we stop clinging to a hollow that feeds only squirrels and ghosts. Progress waits for no man." He paused, letting the murmurs grow. Then the mayor gestured. "Anyone speaking in opposition?" The room shifted. Clara stood. Gasps flitted like birds along the rafters. Men turned in their seats. Silas's face twisted just slightly. She walked to the front, the brooch at her collar catching the dim lantern light. "My name is Clara Rosewell," she said. "Some of you know me. Most of you don't. But I've sewn your shirts, mended your children's coats, and sat beside the man who gave his leg trying to protect what this town was built on." A silence grew, deep and waiting. Pine Hollow is more than timber. It's the breath that feeds this ridge. Without it, there are no trees to cut tomorrow. Without it, your sons ride further and risk more. A voice called from the back, uncertain. "But the line brings money." Clara nodded. "So does blood. So does fire. But not all currency is worth taking." She pulled a small map from her coat, one she had copied by hand from Thaddeus's own notes, showing how the line would snake through the hollow, through floodplain, through unstable rock. She held it up. "This path breaks the land. It doesn't build it." Whispers rose again. Men looked at one another. Some fidgeted, uncomfortable. Then, from the corner, a voice spoke. "She's right." Heads turned. An older logger, missing 3 fingers, stood up slowly. His name was Eben, and he hadn't spoken in a council meeting in years. "We follow Silas. We bury another hollow. Then what?" Another stood. A rancher this time. Then another. The mayor cleared his throat. "Votes must be cast. Hands, please." Clara stepped back. Her heart thudded. The room blurred just slightly. One by one, hands rose. First Eben, then the rancher, then a teacher, a postman, a shopkeep. And when the count was done, narrow but sure, the line was stopped. Clara sat slowly, hands trembling. Silas did not look at her. He walked out, coat stiff, jaw set, boots hitting the wood with clipped finality. Delilah leaned close. "You didn't just sew their coats," she whispered. "You stitched up their spines." Outside, the wind had softened, as if something in the town had finally exhaled. But when Clara returned to Alma's porch, a figure waited near the steps, a man in a black duster, unfamiliar. He held out a letter. "You Clara Rosewell?" he asked. She nodded. "This came from Prescott County, marked urgent." He tipped his hat and rode off without another word. She stared at the seal, brittle and broken with distance. In Thaddeus's room, he was sitting upright now, eyes clearer than they'd been in days. She handed him the envelope without a word. He read it once, then again, then looked up at her, face unreadable. "They're claiming my father sold the hollow years ago," he said. and they're coming to take it by spring. Night came cold and heavy over Whispering Rock, with frost glazing the windows and the stars burning clear above the pines like scattered embers in a coal bed. Inside Alma's boarding house, the lamplight flickered against the lace curtains, while Clara sat motionless at the parlor table. The letter from Prescott County spread open before her. She'd read it 4 times now, each word biting deeper than the last. The ink was thick and officious, the language sharp with finality. Notice of pre-existing deed claim, dated 1878, registered to Elias Holt, hereby granting mineral and timber rights to parties of record. Thaddeus's father had signed it, or someone had made it look that way. He'd said little since reading it himself, only that something wasn't right. That Elias Holt had never so much as discussed selling Pine Hollow, not even in the lean winters when every boardfoot was worth its weight in gold. Now, with spring melt coming and the ridge made vulnerable by thaw, the claimants would ride in, with lawyers, ledgers, and guns if needed. And they'd take what remained of the hollow before the town could blink. Clara folded the letter and slid it into the drawer beside her thread box. She stood. In the back bedroom, Thaddeus was sitting up, wrapped in the old Hudson Bay blanket. His cane rested against the wall. Clara brought him a bowl of broth, setting it down without a word. He didn't look at the bowl. "I found my father's signature once," he murmured. "On a deed to a saddle horse he traded when I was 15. I remember the curl of the H. He made a loop of it, swore it came from his mother's Irish hand." He looked at the letter again. "This one's wrong." She sat beside him, watching the way his fingers hovered over the page but never touched it. "Then we prove it," she said. But proof, in a town like Whispering Rock, didn't lie in courts. It lived in memory, in hidden drawers, in stories people whispered when the wind got high. Over the next 3 days, Clara searched. She questioned the notary at the old church office, a blind woman named Josephine, who remembered Elias Holt and every letter he ever mailed. "I signed a marriage paper for him," Josephine said, "and once a deed to a cattle paddock, but never for Pine Hollow. That land was holy to him." Clara wrote it down. She found old books in the abandoned schoolhouse, tracing boundary maps inked by hand. They bore a different shape than what the letter claimed. Thaddeus, limping through the parlor, remembered an oilskin ledger his father kept, tucked in the floorboards beneath the hearthstone. But when they searched the cabin above the hollow, the place was bare. Someone had been there first. Even the cracked stone had been lifted and set back. Back in town, Silas Penry's name kept floating on people's tongues. He'd been seen riding south weeks earlier, passing through a freight town just near Prescott County. Too close for coincidence. Clara returned to the letter, studying every blot of ink, and then she saw it, a line of faint indentation where the pen had pressed too hard. Not part of the printed form, a handwritten edition. "And any female relative or heir has no right to claim title or possession." Clara stared at it, cold rising in her throat. The wording wasn't legal. It was personal, vindictive, added long after the rest. A weapon against silence. She brought the paper to Alma, who kept a small iron safe in the pantry from her late husband's days as a mining foreman. Inside were old documents, licenses, payroll receipts, and one certificate with the same notary seal, this time genuine. Clara matched the loops, the letters, the date. "They forged his hand," she whispered, "and they used that lie to erase everything." Thunder rumbled that night, a dry storm rolling in from the west. The kind that cracked, but brought no rain. Thaddeus stood on the porch in his coat, watching the sky flash. Clara joined him in silence. "They'll be here by the week's end," he said, "with papers, with men." "I don't care how many come," she replied. He looked at her, the lightning catching in his eyes. "They expect us to fold," she said, but they've misjudged the wrong woman one time too many." His fingers brushed hers, and from inside, the bell above Alma's door rang once. A rider had arrived, drenched in dust, bearing a crimson envelope stamped with wax. This one addressed not to Thaddeus, but to Clara Rosewell of Whispering Rock. She broke the seal and read aloud, "You are hereby summoned to appear for hearing in Red Hollow Township Court, for inquiry into the rightful deed and identity of the land's last living heir." The wind still moves through Whispering Rock the way it always has, soft as breath in the tall pine, threading through the porch slats, whispering down the ridgeline like a name once spoken and never quite forgotten. They say you can hear it on the coldest nights, when the moon is thin and the stars hang low, the sound of saddle leather creaking, or the slow rustle of a skirt hem brushing past dried wildflowers. The hollow still stands, older now, watched over not by lawmen or railmen, or those who once came with pens and fire, but by time itself, and time is patient with the honest. The tree line hasn't moved. The creek still sings its song beneath the frost, and if you look just right in the morning light, you might catch the glint of a brooch pinned to a tall woman's collar as she steps out to greet the day, with a straight back and a quiet gaze. There are still handprints in the beams of the chapel's rafters, stitched seams in shirts worn down to thread, a name carved gently on the underside of a porch rail, Rosewell, weathered by wind, but still legible. The house stands, not grand, but proud, with a handmade table that holds letters no one reads anymore, and a ribbon-wrapped bundle of paper that once helped save a mountain. There's a horse named Valor that won't be ridden by anyone but her, though the saddle's been oiled, and his shoes replaced more times than most would bother. There are eyes in the town now that look kinder, not because the place has changed, but because someone had the strength to stay when it didn't. In the sewing room, the lamp still flickers each night, casting gold across fabric scraps and thread boxes, and the stories those hands have mended stretch farther than any rail ever dared. The children learn their letters in a schoolhouse repainted with quiet hands, and though no one says her name loud, every girl taller than the boys learns to carry herself a little straighter, a little more like Clara. There's a place under the pines where wildflowers still bloom each spring, no matter the frost, and folks say that's where Thaddeus sits sometimes, not to grieve, but to remember. The hollow was never saved by guns or gold or votes, but by the weight of a needle, the truth in a voice that wouldn't be silenced, and the memory of a man who once said, "We don't have many who mend what's worth keeping." There are people now who understand that justice doesn't always come in the season you ask for it, but in the one you least expect. That honor can be buried, but not erased. That when truth takes root, no storm, not even the ones wearing black suits and wax seals, can pull it up. They say Clara never asked for thanks, and never once called herself brave. She just did what needed doing, like stitching a torn hem or tending a sick man's fever, because someone had to. And maybe that's the kind of legacy the West forgets too often. Not the loud ones, but the steady hands, the ones who held the line quietly, who stood in the doorway and didn't flinch, who left a light burning in the window even when they weren't sure anyone was coming home. So if you still believe in that sort of thing, in dignity that doesn't shout, in justice that walks on tired feet, in love that rises slow and stays, you might leave something behind before you go. A name carved in soft wood, a letter never mailed, a wildflower planted where someone will find it. And if this story settled in you, like twilight on the porch, soft and lasting, maybe let it sit a while. Let it remind you that truth doesn't always need to be believed, just remembered. If you felt something tonight, regret, peace, or just a small breath of something good, type 1 in the comments, and know you're not alone. Subscribe to our channel for the next tale carried on the wind. And as always, keep the lantern lit. Someone out there is still walking toward home.